Hello everyone, welcome to a professional development video on revision that is encouraging and helping to guide students in the revision process and creating accountability for students in completing the revision process. Let's see, if you are watching this video, you have already made it to our QEP org under the section here, Guiding Revision. The PowerPoint is uploaded that I'm going to be using, and there are also uploads and links to the other sources that I will be referring to during this presentation. So let's get started here. So again, this is about guiding and encouraging revision. And this comes about because part of our student learning outcomes for our writing intensive curriculum is encouraging and guiding a writing process. So that includes the difficult step of guiding revision. And I find this to be a very challenging thing to do with students. It's much more fun to do the brainstorming and topic selection, getting them to write their drafts, doing more creative work. But for all of us, that work after the first draft is not something that we typically look forward to. So I think that's one way of looking at it, is that our brains are wired not to want to do revision because our brains see it on that superficial level of repetition. Oh, I've done a draft, why do I have to do another draft? And you have to push people to understand that a first draft is never really complete, it's never as good as it could be, and that it does need to be revised, and that it is worthwhile working on revision. And I think part of what we can do to trick our students' brains into seeing this as something new and different is to give them different activities and different approaches to revision so it doesn't just feel very repetitive to them. So they get feedback at different stages. Now the feedback that they get on a draft, it could come from you. It could also come from students, their fellow students. You might have peer review groups in your class. You might require students to visit the writing center, and you might also have a writing fellow who's a writing peer tutor who's embedded in your class. So, the feedback that is allowing them to do revision could come from other students. And again, it also might come from you. You might be giving students feedbacks on drafts, although you are not required to. You also might be conducting writing conferences with students. So as kind of a prequel to talking about revision is that if you do intend to give students feedback on drafts, I just want to give you some, feedback I've learned over the years in doing research as to how to make this less time consuming. When writing conferences individual writing conferences with students are very heavily promoted in first year composition studies. And for a time I stopped doing them because I felt like they were very time consuming, and I would spend all this time telling students what to do to revise, and then they wouldn't do it, and I was like, what's the point? I feel like it's a waste of time for all of us. And then a colleague of mine who's no longer here, Matt Theotto, kind of shamed me into starting to do them again. And I think some students had asked for writing conferences. They probably had them in another class and didn't get them in mine. But when I went back to it, I thought I've got to set some structure and some boundaries so that I don't feel like I'm just giving and giving and giving and the students aren't doing anything with what I'm giving them. So I would say set time limits if you're going to do individual writing conferences. If I'm doing them for freshman comp, I might be doing them for 40 students. So can't spend half an hour with every student. One thing that really helped me was to ask students to bring their own questions. So I asked them bring 2 or 3 questions or concerns that you have about this draft. That creates engagement. Then the student is talking about something that they feel like is a problem. Now, you may identify other things that are actually bigger problems, but I think it also helps the student to, they've come and they've done some work. They have something to contribute to this conference, and it's not just going to be you having to do all the work and doing all the assignment and doing all the putting forth all the energy. I think a writing conference can also be a good place to check in and make sure the student understands the assignment. Sometimes they don't get the assignment. It might be written in a way that they just don't understand, or they may be interpreting your words differently than you do. If you ask them, for example, to write a research paper that is a very broad generic term, and we all interpret this differently. So, you know, this is a writing conference can be a good place to get students going in the direction you want them to. I would say in a writing conference, focus on higher order concerns first and not lower order. And I'll refer to a handout in a minute to explain that. I would say if the writing has a lot of grammatical errors, a lot of stylistic errors, I would say you can't fix everything. Rome was not built in a day. All the research has shown that writing is learned and improved over a very long period of time. I would say focus on the most important 2 or 3 writing problems, and you just got to let the rest go. Let's see. Let me go back here. Concerning these higher order concerns, and this is a handout that is up on Blackboard. It's reading, responding to student writing. This comes from a handout that I give writing fellows to help them respond to student drafts, because that's all they do. They read first drafts. So they're doing a lot of hard work. Down here on the 3rd page, no, this isn't the right handout. Okay, I think I might have the right handout here. Yes, and I'll correct that. Okay. This is down here. Okay, so higher order concerns. This is on page 2. The higher order concerns are the big things that students are just going to get a terrible grade if they don't fix these things. They're the much more important considerations. So usually they're higher order concerns around critical thinking, addressing the assignment, going into detail development, all that kind of stuff. So things you might want to think about, let's say you have a writing conference and the student doesn't bring a draft. Now that's a good place to figure out why. Have they been sick? Have they had tons of work? Do they even understand the assignment? You know, what's going on that they don't have a draft? Is the draft very incomplete or the idea is very underdeveloped? And I've got some ideas here that you could help the student work on during the writing conference. I think it's important too at some point to have the student do some work during the writing conference. Is the draft on target? Is it meeting the objectives of the assignment? Sometimes if students are pressed for time or if they don't understand an assignment, they will write something, but it is not what you want them to write. So they may write a personal narrative about a mission trip experience, and what I really wanted them to write about was the role of missionaries in the novel by Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart. So, oh, I'm writing about missionaries, but I don't really want to hear their personal story about missionaries unless it somehow correlates with the book. I want them to analyze the novel. Does the draft meet your minimum writing expectations? That's another question. Then you could look at things if you're asking for a thesis statement of focus. This is a big higher order concern. You can look at questions around organization, if the writing is focused, unified, coherent, if all the ideas are in a logical order that you can follow. And again, if they aren't, I've got some strategies for working on organization in a writing conference. Transitions, oftentimes even very strong writers are lacking in transitional words and phrases between paragraphs and between ideas within paragraphs. The paragraphs may not be very well developed, and by that I mean use of details, explanations, examples, description, quotations from research, that kind of thing. An audience, is the audience addressed appropriately? So the audience is probably an academic audience, the professor, the fellow students in the class. So are they using a tone, language, etc., that is appropriate for addressing that audience? And if you're working in a writing intensive class, this is where the concept of grammar mechanics, what is appropriate for the level of grammar that's appropriate for addressing a formal audience, etc. Lower order concerns have to do a lot with style, grammar mechanics, repetitive words and phrases, those kinds of things. Those, for me, you know, you could have perfect grammar, but if you are really inappropriate with the audience, you're gonna get a bad grade. Or if you don't address the assignment, you're gonna get a bad grade. So I would say focus on the things that are more important to the grade, and then, you know, you can't, I have a separate video on dealing with grammar mechanics and that kind of thing. So let's see. So that is what I mean by these higher order concerns. So in a writing conference, you know, you have to pick your battle. And I would say even with higher order concerns, you can't fix everything. Fix the ones that you think are the main problem. I guess it's like triage in the emergency room. You've got to save the patient and then worry about plastic surgery later. I think too, you might consider giving feedbacks as questions instead of directions. Why is something here? How do you see it working? What do you mean by this? And that makes students figure out the answers for themselves. It's very easy for us to be the editor in a conference and to go through and fix everything for the student, but then you've done their work for them. And isn't that annoying? I don't think that's not helping the student be a better writer. And it's also very frustrating for us to feel like we are the personal editors of all of our students' work. So I would say giving feedback as questions, you know, circling something. Do you see this as your thesis statement? Why? You know, do you think that what is the argument that you're expressing here? Here's one I write all the time. Why is this quote here? Because oftentimes I feel like students, the quote is not really connected to what they're writing about. You know, why is this quote here? How do you see it connected to what you were writing before and after? You can even give feedback as a reader that makes them do work. You can say, as a reader, I'm really confused going from this paragraph to the next. You need to help me. How does this paragraph connect to the one before and after it? What do you mean by this word or phrase? And again, I don't think that any of us should have to go through and correct student work, because again, it's not my place. That's something that they need to learn to do for themselves. And so our feedback should be enabling them to do this work themselves, because on one level, for me, I like to make them work because, I don't know, it's just a good thing in life. But on another level, it's making them accountable. It is making them engage in their writing on a deeper level. And it's teaching them, you know, something about life. You know, there's not going to be someone going around cleaning up your messes all the time. At least not me. All right. So those are some things to think about if you are going to be doing conferences or if you're going to be responding to student writing. And again, I would say minimize your time. Don't turn yourself into the editor. That's what you love to do, then you can go get a job like at the New Yorker or something. All right, next I'm going to talk about some activities that you can do or you can lead students to do in class. And again, these are activities both to encourage revision and to get the students to get involved in their writing. So I have found that a lot of writing can have organizational problems, especially anything that is longer than 3 to 5 pages. We tend to be very good at writing short, coherent things, but once something gets longer, it could be a huge organizational problem. And this happens at every level of student writing. I am currently working with a graduate student, and her biggest problem in her master's thesis is a lack of organization. So one thing you can do, an activity with students, is if you get some colorful highlighters, some of them come in packs of, 4 or 5 different fluorescent colors, and you can just have, a set of these that you don't give them to the students, you just keep them for yourself and hand them out in class. And they can use a different color highlighter for every idea in the essay. So if they have a basic outline of this is my thesis statement, these are the ideas that support it, or if they've actually written out an outline as part of the stage in the writing process, you can say, okay, each section in your outline, that's a different color. Go through in your essay and highlight where everything related to this idea appears. And in a perfect world, they're going to see a page where there's a big chunk of green, then a big chunk of yellow, then a big chunk of pink. But if they see green, pink, yellow, green, yellow, pink, lots of different colors all over the place, then it will be visually apparent to them that they have an organization problem. And sometimes students who are more visual or who respond more strongly to patterns and colors, this will get them to see something that your words will not let them see. You can also use Post-it notes. You can put the main idea, the focus, or the thesis on a Post-it note, and then each support on a Post-it note, and then, kind of try to match the paragraphs to those Post-it notes. Something that I think is very helpful for students to do is to have a paper draft and to cut it up. and to make sure they have to have tape, because if there are paragraphs that go from one page to the next, they have to tape them together. But to cut it up and spread it out and just make sure that everything is flowing, you know, point A, all the paragraphs having to do with point A, they're all together. And I was working with another student a couple of years ago on his undergraduate thesis, and he had a terrible organizational problem. He had good ideas. His individual paragraphs were all well done, and they all were coherent. But, you know, topic point A, he would have paragraphs here on page 5, on page 7, and I was like, oh, you're driving me nuts. So we went to the computer lab and printed out his essay, and we cut it up, and we went in a classroom and spread it out, and all of a sudden it was like the light bulb went off in his head. He was like, oh, I see it now. And we reorganized it. We taped the whole thing back together. It was like 20 pages long, and he fixed his problem. So that can be a very powerful exercise for students. You have to have space to be able to spread out, but you know, I do it for my own work, so I don't recommend students do things that I myself don't do. Something else you can do, I know that oftentimes we think of outlining as something you do before you write a draft, and that's great. If you want to do that with your students, that's fine. But something that can be helpful is taking your draft and creating an outline from that draft. And that then again, you can very quickly see organizational problems. You know, introduction, thesis, and then if you're writing one sentence to capture or one phrase to capture each paragraph, the student will very quickly see where there's not, the ideas are not flowing, or where you mention idea A and then you come back to it later and it's not making any sense. So I think those are some kind of hands-on activities that students can do that get them to re-see the paper, and they kind of trick their brains into thinking, oh, this isn't the same old work. I'm actually doing something different because I'm using my highlighters or Post-it notes. I'm cutting stuff up, and it can appeal to, I don't know what it's called, tactile learning or kinesthetic. I think that's the fancy word for it. So, but again, it can be very helpful, and sometimes it can be a real problem getting students to see their organizational problems. Something else they can do after a draft, if you have let enough time go by, is if you have done peer review and with your students and they've had another student peer review, they could do their own peer review. And so they could take the same questions that they answered about another student's paper and then try to take a critical look at their own. You could also have them challenge them to take their draft and rewrite it or explain it for someone who knows nothing about the topic or the discipline. So frequently they have a roommate or a friend who's in a different major. You could even say, explain this to a 4-year-old, and that will help them if they are having trouble being direct, if they are having trouble being concrete with their ideas and giving examples and explaining that. This challenge can help them with that problem because they can't rely on jargon or kind of those, I don't know, fallback explanations that we all have in our disciplines. And again, that's an activity. It doesn't feel repetitive. It feels kind of like a creative writing exercise. Now these are all for bigger problems like with content and organization. I have found with stylistic or word problems, especially with a repetitive word or just anything that students are replacing. I have a problem repeating. I have a problem with using however all the time, relying upon that. And I have found using find replace, that function within Microsoft Word, I can just put in however and it will find them all for me. And then I can change them and do whatever. Or let's say a student has a problem with semicolons. They have no idea how to use a semicolon, which is becoming more and more prevalent. Instead of relying on their brains to find all the semicolon, they can use find, type in a semicolon, and they'll be able to find them all. Let's say there's a word that they're using incorrectly. Sometimes students will use, if they're writing about feminism, instead of writing about feminism, they'll write about feministic, or they'll come up with all these weird words that, you know, like, no, that's just use feminism. That's the actual proper word. They can use find and replace for those kinds of things too. I recommend this because looking for words and looking for punctuation is like really, really boring for our brain, and our brain will trick ourselves into missing things so that the brain can get through with it and go on to doing something a lot more fun than revising or editing. All right. Let's see. Something else you can talk about in class are your own revision strategies. I'm sure all of y'all have things that you do that, you know, I'm not going to cover in this video because I'm not aware of them, but students find it refreshing if you talk about your own struggles as a writer, because they look at us and they think that we're these wonderful, perfect people who write one draft and we're done. And that's not really the case. And so I'll take in my drafts and hold them up and show how they're all written on, or, you know, show how I've done a reorganization thing or anything like that. So that that can be helpful for them to understand that this is something that we all go through. And I think sometimes students think, oh, I'll never be a perfect writer. What's the point? But the point is that practice helps you to become a better writer. Something else you can ask students to do after they've done a draft is to write a 1-paragraph summary of whatever that writing assignment is. So then that's what they think their essay is about, or what their essay is supposed to be about. And then they can compare the summary to their introduction and thesis statement, topic sentences, conclusions. Do all these things match up to what the student thinks the essay is about? And this will help the student who might be having some kind of gap between what's in their essay and what they really think it's about, because sometimes it doesn't get down on paper. They just haven't written it down. They've worked it out in their head, and now they might be just not getting everything down on paper. Something else you can have students do is to go through and number all their paragraphs, and then they can make a chart in their journal, or they can type it up on their computer, where they divide the page in half, and on one side they write what the paragraph says, and then on the other side, what is it doing to support the thesis? What criteria of the assignment is it meeting, etc. And that will get them to really, okay, what is it? What is the content of this paragraph? And what function is it serving? Because sometimes, you know, we're just writing. We're just putting stuff down because I did this research and I have these ideas and I'm just putting it down. But what is in this paragraph, and what is its purpose here? And that will get them to, that'll help with so many things. It'll help with focus, content, organization, repetition. So many times I'll write something and I'm like, this paragraph is saying the same thing as the previous one. It's pointless and I'm going to irritate my reader. So this is another exercise that they can do. They can also create a short, I don't know, summary of their assignment. So you could call it a tweet, since they're very familiar with Twitter, or they might not know what a headline is anymore, but create a tweet or a headline that sums up their writing assignment. And again, you can have them check that each part of the assignment is true to that tweet or headline, that there's nothing that is going in a different direction or off the path or not relevant. All right, so all these previous things, let me go back. These are all just activities you can have students do. Now, if you have time in class to do them, then that's fine, but they are also things you can explain or model how to do in class and then ask them to do outside of class and bring evidence that they did it to class. I know a lot of times we worry about, you know, I don't have tons of time to give in class writing. I can't have them revise their papers in class. You know, I need that for the content that I'm teaching. Anything that I try to pick out these activities so that they can be either used in class or you can assign them as homework, and then just, you know, have students bring them to class. You can check them real quick. This is the kind of thing that I would give, you know, participation points for. If they come to class without their tweet or their headline, then they get a 0. You know, it's just like any other assignment. So those are just some strategies. Oh, I think I've got, before we move on, I do have some other things in here. Let's see. Oh, nope, that's not what I want. Guiding revision. Okay, so here I've also got some other sources about techniques to encourage revision and responding to student writing. So I think they're both from the WAC Clearinghouse. That's the Writing Across the Curriculum Clearinghouse, which is managed by Colorado State. Here's the first one about responding to student writing, and it says a lot of the things that I've already said. You know, make sure all the criteria on your assignment are there. Responding to drafts, let's see. You know, make sure your comments reflect your priorities about writing. You know, don't be an editor. Limit your suggestions on grammar and style issues. Remember to make a positive comment, and it has to be truthful. They will know if it is not. And my fallback for being truthful is, I love this topic. I can tell how engaged you are in it and how much it means to you. And that's typically true. I try to craft my assignments so that students can write about something they like. Write constructive comments students can act upon, do something about, etc. All of these things. So there's also a handout here, techniques to encourage revision. Here's some little introductory stuff. What we've already talked about, require a draft, and we're already doing this in writing intensive classes. You can give students a checklist of what they should revise for, and that could come from a peer review checklist that you've given them to help with reviewing their fellow students. So look for global issues, and again, that's another way of saying higher order issues, and one looking at sentence level issues. You can give students a sample paper, a sample student essay with the student's name removed, and a model can help them see, you know, this is what I need to aspire to. You can do an outline after the draft, and I already explained that, and this gives some specific directions. Peer review, I've got another video on how to do peer review. You can do a short either discussion, or you can have students turn in questions about the challenges that they feel after doing a draft and what they can do to complete the assignment and turn in a stronger revision. You can have conferences. You always, I think, giving students the flexibility to change after they've written a draft is important. They may discover as they write, if they're discovery writers like me, they may write a draft and figure out this isn't really what I want to do. So I always give students permission to do that. Again, if you have time, you can do in-class revision. You can go around and talk to students. I mean, you can be direct. You can say, you know, what's a problem you're having, and have you come up for a solution? Show me the paragraph. Students like it when you go around and poke into their business. All right. Review drafts and give specific comments, cover sheets and checklists, etc. So, and again, and you can share these handouts with students, again, revising at the global level. Reading a paper aloud really helps because it makes your brain slow down. I would say recommending to students to read their paper aloud. They could also record themselves reading their papers and then listen to it. That can really help students who are more of oral learners or oral listeners, and it might help them more to listen to their essay rather than read it, because sometimes when we read, we can just tune it out, and then that person who tunes out the written word may listen more strongly. Here's one, color coding sentences. Again, visually that can help. You could have them review the assignment in class. Okay, I'm rereading the assignment. What questions do I have now that I've worked on a draft? What haven't I done that I need to for this assignment? Going to the Writing Center, etc. So those are some good resources there. Then let's see. The last thing I would like to talk about here, and this is the last, is creating some accountability. Because if you don't create accountability, you're really going to have no way of encouraging revision or kind of making them do it. So, you know, if let's say you don't read the drafts, let's say students are doing peer review, or they have a writing fellow or whatever, you really have no sense as a professor unless you've read the drafts if they are better. And I don't encourage or make anybody read drafts. Some people do, some people don't. But if you have students turn in a reflection letter with the final draft of their paper, that's where you can hold them accountable for a lot of stuff. And that's where you can ask them in this reflection letter to identify, to self-explain, what about my draft needed revision, how did I revise it, and then to provide examples. So let's say they needed transitional phrases. Okay, here are the transitional phrases I needed, and here's the places I need them, and here's the ones I used. You can have them do this even with things like editing for documentation style. You know, I didn't do my works cited page correctly. Here's an example of how it was incorrect, and here's an example of how I corrected it. In this reflection letter, you can also have them explain how the feedback they got helped them to revise. So that's where you can build in accountability for peer review if you have them do this. I would say if a student goes to the Writing Center, they need to be accountable for remembering the advice they got and putting it into action. This is where if you're working with a writing fellow, you can see, oh, this is what's going on between the students and the writing fellow. And if you're giving them feedback, this is where you can see, oh, they're doing what I said, etc. And I would say I do this in classes that have multiple writing assignments. When they get to the second writing assignment, I will ask them also to reflect upon how they have improved their writing from the first writing assignment based on the feedback I gave them on their graded draft of the first assignment. So that's another way of dealing with that frustration of I'm writing comments on the final draft that I'm grading, but they're going into the void. No one is reading them or doing anything about them. Well, if students write a second paper in your class, then part of that process should be looking back at the first paper. Okay, what did the instructor tell me I needed to work on? And then having them work on that for the second paper and provide proof that they worked on that. So this is all about me trying to cut down your frustration or my own frustration. All right, so let's see. Someday I will get better at these PowerPoints. We need a QEP on PowerPoints. So right now I'm going to show you some examples of these reflection letters. Again, I think this is probably one of the best things I have done to help students improve their writing and to help them have accountability in their writing. So I have two examples from my own classes, and then I have an example from a writing scholar, teacher, one of the founding people of the WAC movement, Barbara Walvoord. And hers is, she calls it cover sheet. You can call it a cover sheet, a cover letter. I used to call them cover letters, and then a lot of people were telling me that terminology confused students and that reflection letter would be better. You know, as long as they're doing it, it doesn't really matter. So Barbara Walvoord does it with, she says, you know, I won't take an essay without a cover sheet or the reflection letter. And that's something you can do. You can say, I won't take your final draft without that cover letter. And you can do it that way. I have a pretty hefty penalty in my rubric for not having a reflection letter, and they only forget it once. It's at least a letter grade, if not more, because it's what I value. So here you can also do it where not only do you ask students to reflect upon the revision and editing that they have done, but you can ask them things that you are hoping that they did. And this can be kind of a self-check. Now this is for a literary analysis on poetry. And she asks them to self-identify, did they read the poems at least 3 times? That's a signal to the student that ding, 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 if you didn't read these poems 3 times, you might not be getting a great grade. She asks them to self-report how many hours they spent on the paper. Students are pretty honest about this. They're not going to write down, I spent 200 hours. She has a requirement of having at least one other person read the paper and give feedback. She asks if they have reread twice for grammar, punctuation, and spelling. This is something students, you know, they're not going to take the time to do. It's boring. They are going to wait until the last minute, etc. Something else you can do in terms of that last minute editing is you can have students bring their final draft to class, and this works really well. I think whether you have a paper copy or an electronic copy, but giving them like 10 minutes in class to do a last minute edit, or have them turn it in and then wait a couple days and go back and do that last minute edit, because sometimes they just don't leave themselves time, and they're children. So yeah, have you reread it at least twice for the editing stuff? Have you used spell check? You'd be surprised how many people don't. Have you used the correct format as specified in the instructions? Do you think a reader could tell what the thesis is? Is it a quality thesis, etc.? I like this question. If I had more time to spend on this paper, I would do what? So they have to turn something like this in with the final draft that you grade, and you can comment on it. You can, just give it back to them blank, whatever, and then have them hang on to it, because then they can use it if they write a second or third paper. So I put in directions here. Yeah, Okay, oh, I only opened the ones. I put in one for composition class and one for a majors class on literature. So here is where I called it a cover letter, and this is part of my assignment sheet. The cover letter is part of the assignment. That's why I have a hefty penalty on my rubric. So I'll ask students, and this is helpful. I do a lot of touchy-feely things with English 101 and 102 because oftentimes they're just overwhelmed and they've been traumatized by some high school teacher, and they need a little bit of emotional massage. So I'll ask them to reflect on what they're most proud of with whatever assignment it is. And this is a project they did, an argument essay. So what do they think that they did the best? And this also helps them to self-identify things that they are good at, because oftentimes they just have no clue. Do they think that they have changed their argumentative skills by working on this project? My hope is that they have improved, but that's kind of leading them to ask them if they've improved. I asked them what they struggled with, what was challenging or difficult for them, and how did they overcome this? And then here's where I require peer review. They have to do it in class, and I'll ask them how they contributed to their group and how the feedback helped them revise. And this is creating accountability for participating in peer review and for revision. Then I have them do something where they self-identify 2 to 3 repeated errors in grammar, punctuation, and MLA from their draft. And this is probably the 3rd assignment they've done in the class. So just 2 to 3 repeated errors from their draft. And these are things that I've corrected in their previous assignments. They have to copy out the sentences with the errors in the cover letter or reflection letter, and then they have to correct the sentences. So this is showing me that they're learning how to self-identify sentences with problems and correct them. So that is an example of that. And then this is a cover letter that's a lot more like the Barbara Walward one. And this was for an English majors class, and they had to bring it and do it. They did it, I think, right when they turned in their writing project. So this was writing project number 2. So they had already done number 1 and had my feedback from it. So they had to have writing goals for their writing project. So I asked them to revise those things. They had to talk about the strengths of their writing project, the weaknesses, why they were able to do the positive things that they did, why they were unable to do what they wanted to. They had to identify things they wanted help with, things they might want differently, how much time did they spend rereading. And I asked them how many drafts they wrote. Now, this was a class in which I did not require them to bring drafts to class. We didn't do, I think we did peer review once at the end. So many of them, and they're English majors, they would only write 1 draft. This just really hit it home for me that we all need to require and have accountability for drafts. All right, so that is how we can help close that loop and making sure that students are completing all these steps of the writing process. I will say as well that having that reflection letter at the end will really help you with the QEP rubric. That's where you really get a good sense of how engaged students are in the writing process. It can also help you keep track of how much students are participating with the writing fellows. If you're requiring them to meet with a writing fellow and they don't, and it's not in the reflection letter, then that can be reflected in their participation grade. And this will also help you with, I already said this, I think, but with filling out that QEP rubric, because you'll see how much of the writing process that they are engaged in, and you'll also get to see how deeply they're engaged. Maybe they're only doing spell check and correcting grammar, and that's not really revision. If you don't see evidence of the students really looking at the quality of their ideas, the quality of their organization, addressing these issues of, am I writing for the audience? Am I using all the disciplinary language and terms and style that I'm supposed to be? If you don't see students engaging with these more substantive issues, then they're really not, they're only superficially editing that paper. They're not really taking a revision or a relook at it. Alrighty, so I hope that this has been helpful. I would say, I throw out all these activities. I'm not suggesting that any one person should do all of them. You may only like one of them, and that's fine. So I would say, look at these activities, think about some that might work for the assignments that you use, for your personal teaching style, that might work for your students. think about how you might model the activities for the students. And then again, the big theme of all these professional developments is how are we holding the students accountable for their writing. All right, so if you have questions about any of this, please let me know. I'd be happy to meet with you and brainstorm, talk about your problems with getting students to revise and holding them accountable for it. Again, this is a challenging part of teaching writing. I will admit that, and I will not judge or shame anybody, including myself. So yeah, just get in touch and let me know. If you have a strategy that I did not talk about here, but you would like to share, please let me know. I'd be happy to redo this video and add it in. I would also be happy to, if you had a handout or an activity sheet, I would love to post it on our QEP org. Thanks.